Let me make several points in conclusion, general points about this long narrative. First, I'm not proposing a model of mechanically unfolding progress, which is familiar in the Marxist dialectic or even in religious models that end up in rapture or heaven. The model I'm offering here of Movements and Machiavellians is dynamic, and it's about a permanent tension. It's more like a yin-yang than a dialectic that comes to a plateau. The space in the chart that you've seen here between the overlapping circles, where the movement and Machiavellian circles create a common area, is the point where we are living tonight in the here and now. And if you think about it, we're living the reform, we're experiencing the reform that others have achieved and that we have successfully protected. There's nothing inevitable about it. It rests on a balance of power between movements and Machiavellians. If we fight to maintain it, it can be maintained. If we fail, the right wing can succeed in taking it away. Second, the model that I use is underemphasizing the role of organizations in the creation of social change. That's because organizations rise and fall, they come and go, they play important roles, and what we need to know about organizations, besides their impermanence, is that they fall into two categories. Movement organizations, I would call catalytic organizations. They rise and fall with the movement, like SNCC did or SDS did in the early 60s, or the early phase of Move On in the 90s. And the other kind of organization is a bureaucratic organization which represents the original ideals of the movement, but comes to have a whole agenda of expanding its power and presence as an interest group or an advocacy group, like the ACLU, the AFL-CIO, the National Council of Churches, those kinds of groups. I think the most important probably are the organized networks that combine both tendencies, catalytic and bureaucratic, that have grassroots chapters that push on the permanent bureaucracy, like the Sierra Club, for example. It's important for activists to play a role in both. But the most important role is that of the organizer. What's an organizer? It's different than an organization. An organizer is someone who's dedicated to awakening and empowering people who see themselves as hopeless, apathetic, unqualified, powerless. The organizer is kind of like Siddhartha, helping carry people across the river, steering them, and never landing on the other side, but instead returning to go back and pick up others. Or like Harriet Tubman, organizing slaves to join the Underground Railroad heading north and then returning south to organize resistance at another plantation. The organizer somehow has or can develop the charisma, the skill, the ability to engage people to meet and act and protest. But the organizer is a listener. The organizer leads others to lead themselves. Then the organizer disappears to start all over again. The organizer sees the potential that no one else does, the potential that underlies a picture that looks like nothing's going on. And out of that apparent nothingness, the organizer turns people who were nobodies into somebodies, and an organization is born. That was the lesson taught us by Ella Baker in the early 60s. Third, the terms I'm using are fluid. They are not fixed categories. A movement for change is completely unpredictable. A Machiavellian can suddenly become a radical and drop out. A movement leader can become a Machiavellian, and a Machiavellian can become enlightened and achieve a kind of historic greatness through their interaction with social movements. For example, we know that Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and John Kennedy were careful pragmatists, conservatives, when they came to their presidencies. But they became transformed somehow because the times and the movements of those times demanded greatness from them, and they could rise to the challenge. Howard Zinn is absolutely right that there's been too much focus on great leaders and too little attention to great movements. But what's interesting is the chemistry that can be self-generated by movements in relation to leaders in times of great crisis. We need to learn more about how this happens. Andrew Johnson, Harry Truman, and Lyndon Johnson are not remembered as great leaders for peace and justice, but Lincoln and Roosevelt and Kennedy are, because of their interaction with the social movements of the time. Fourth, I want to say that the concept of revolution is not incorporated enough in the model, because except for the American Revolution, there has been no such event in this country for 350 years. There have been people with revolutionary dreams. I'm one of them. There have been revolutionaries who aspired to revolution. There have been gradual revolutionaries. There have been violent revolutionaries, but there hasn't been a revolution, unless you define it as a change so gradual that no one knows when it's finally occurred. It's possible that a revolution lies ahead, and the model doesn't predict one, but why not? It's possible. My history and experience lead me to a different conclusion, though, at least for now, that revolution is blocked by the very Machiavellian system I have described. The revolutionary threat, in other words, contributes to the achievement of the radical reform, and then the revolutionary threat subsides. Which brings me to the final point, and that is this, that many of us, including myself, have a hard time grappling with, and we tend to underestimate the role of assassinations at the peak of the counter movement, and how those assassinations prevent or delay the realization of our hopes for generations. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which was a Confederate conspiracy, prevented a greater effort at Reconstruction. The assassination of John Kennedy came after he welcomed the 1963 March on Washington and advocated a reversal of the Cold War nuclear arms race. The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy ended any hope of reversing our priorities and saving lives lost in vain in Vietnam and on the streets of our cities. The deaths of many others, from Medgar Evers to Malcolm X to Fred Hampton, blocked so many opportunities for peaceful, progressive political change that we will never know what might have happened. We became might-have-beens. And we're seeing the rise of another violent storm today in the counter-movement that is coming, represented in the recent shootings in Tucson and the level of threats against our president. It was assassination that prevented my generation from knowing whether our hopes could actually be realized in a radical reform of the system. I feel a responsibility, therefore, now to recall not only the great legacy and great hopes left by social movements from generation to generation, but to warn our country of the threat of violence that we have seen before and we will see again. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that these commentaries have been useful to you. If there is time for a few questions, I'd be delighted to take them.